This week we begin our discussion of research using the internet. So it's essentially the idea of discussing the computer as a research tool, both through the internet and in and of itself, in terms of some of the technology that we have available to us. So we're going to start the discussion specifically looking at web search engines. So we're talking about our basic Google, Yahoo, Bing type search engines, and how we can use those to better arrive at results when we're looking for health information on the internet. We're going to look at this from two perspectives. The first perspective has to do with how reliable and how valid the information is that we find on the internet. For whatever reason, when it comes to health and medical information, the quality of the information that we find on the internet ranges from sometimes very, very good all the way down to just downright fraudulent. And there's a lot in between. A lot of information that just has inaccuracies in it. It could be mildly inaccurate, it could be terribly inaccurate, and for a variety of reasons. So we want to spend a little bit of time discussing that and how we can better identify the information really that's going to best serve us. One of the ways to look at it is that there's a cost associated with relying on inaccurate information. And that cost could vary. If it's in a professional setting, it could result in legal liability. If it's in an academic setting, relying on inaccurate information may result in a poor grade. So we have to keep in mind that there's always a trade-off there. If it's a personal decision that we make, we could end up wasting money. We could end up wasting time chasing down something that is worthless when we could have been doing something more productive. So again, consider that there's always a trade-off and always a cost. The second perspective that we're going to look at will be how to do better searches, how to find the information that we're looking for much more quickly and directly. And I think everybody's had the experience of going out and doing a Google search for something and getting billions of hits in 0.2 seconds. And they're all over the place. The results are just everywhere, except for where we want the information. So very often we look and we look and we look, and even though there's mountains and avalanches of information, we're just not really seeing that one elusive piece of information that we need. So we'll talk about how to do that. And there's actually quite a bit of technology that's available to help us do that, as well as some changes to how we go about the search. So we'll start off talking about information quality, and then we'll, in a separate lecture, look at information search efficiencies. So to start this discussion, I want to begin by drawing a distinction between empirical versus anecdotal data, and I'm sure you've all heard those two terms before. When we talk about empirical data, we're talking about data that's collected using the scientific method. This is really information that is collected by researchers, and every effort is made to minimize any type of bias or error in the collection of that information. The idea is that a study is done, it's based upon the scientific method, and the results are then reviewed by peers, and this is part of the peer review process. I'm sure you've all heard about peer-reviewed journals, and the idea here is that when a study is completed, it's very typically submitted for publication to a peer-reviewed journal. Peer-reviewed journals are in the business of producing the best quality, most scientifically valid information available. And when an article is submitted for publication, there typically are teams of anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 peer reviewers that review the article and essentially try to find anything that they can wrong with it. Based on their review, they then make recommendations to the editors of the publication on a given study. And typically there are one of 3 recommendations that are returned. First might be, go ahead and publish it just the way it is, it's perfect. And I can tell you that almost never happens. I've never seen it happen before. The second which is probably the far more likely thing to have happen, would be that the study is inherently not bad, but there are some limitations to it. There are some issues with it, and the reviewers will ask the authors to come back, review a few things, revisit, maybe do a bit more analysis, or discuss something a little bit more thoroughly in terms of how they went about the study or address a particular concern that they might have. And based upon those modifications, the study is then eligible for publication. The third one that happens is probably the most common thing to have happen, and that's where a study just gets rejected outright. And that can happen for a number of reasons. Either it just really wasn't done well enough, or it wasn't relevant enough. That sometimes is cited as a reason, or some combination. Or there's just a limitation to it where the reviewers did not feel as though it would really contribute anything significantly to the body of knowledge. So there's a definite screening process that occurs. Once a study is published, the review continues. Peer-reviewed journals are typically read by other researchers and academics and scientists, and depending on the target audience, practicing professionals. And very often they'll review them and they will critique the articles. So a researcher might read an article, see what they perceive to be maybe a problem with that study, and they can submit what would essentially be like a letter to the editor, which can then be published in the journal, saying, okay, this study has some particular problems that I see in it. And then very often the study authors will sometimes come back and respond to that. And sometimes you'll see this back and forth occur over several issues of the publication. But it's a really good process because it makes us discuss this information. It puts it out there, it invites criticism, and it invites debate. And that's good. That's how we learn. That's how the body of knowledge grows, is by questioning what we think we already know and what we think we're learning from these studies. So this is the idea of empirical data. So typically empirical data is a good thing in our environment here. Now the alternative to that is anecdotal data. So anecdotal data is basically what is not empirical. The word anecdotes comes from the idea of just stories. So anecdotes are stories. Anecdotal data comes from word of mouth. I have a friend whose sister used this product and she lost 30 pounds in the first 5 days. It must be really, really good. Completely anecdotal. We have no idea whether any of that is true, and if it is true, we don't know whether it was due to the use of the product or some other problem or some other issue. So there's absolutely really no way to verify it, no way to question it, no way to debate it or discuss it with whoever was the person who originated the information. Anytime you see a product advertised where they use like a testimonial, kind of like the one you're seeing up on the screen here, that's a really great example of anecdotal data. There is just absolutely no way you can really rely upon that to make any sort of a decision, because you don't know whether any of it is actually correct or not. Could be that it is, could be that it isn't, but there's no way to verify it, and that's the important part of that. Very often we'll see that anecdotal data is used as a kind of a marketing ploy to sell products, where you have people kind of talk about their experiences. Again, we can't really scientifically rely on that because we just don't know how accurate that is and what other factors might have been involved in the outcomes that they say they experienced. So this is the idea of empirical versus anecdotal data. Now, in general, we want to be skeptical of anecdotal data. We don't know where it comes from. We have no way of tracking where it comes from. We don't know how it was acquired. We don't know how it was collected. We don't know how it was analyzed or if it was analyzed. So the general rule here is that when we're looking at anecdotal data, we want to have some healthy skepticism about that information. We want to make sure that we're questioning it, and we're not just assuming that it's correct or assuming that it is what the individual says that it is. Now, concept of evidence-based medicine is one that's going to be really important to us here. Evidence-based medicine, sometimes referred to as evidence-based practice, and they both do mean the same thing. In the medical environment, in the healthcare industry, we typically use EBM, or evidence-based medicine. Other disciplines may use the term evidence-based practice. And this definition here is one of the ones that I have found to be probably one of the better ones. And it is that evidence-based medicine is the conscientious, explicit, judicious, and reasonable use of modern best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. Evidence-based medicine integrates clinical experience and patient values with the best available research information. Now, the key term here is best available research information. The idea behind evidence-based medicine is that healthcare decisions should be based upon empirical data. So when a healthcare provider makes a recommendation to a patient, it should be based on clear empirical research that has found that for whatever the issue is that that patient is expressing, that there is a treatment that has been statistically shown to be beneficial in the treatment of that with a relatively low risk of adverse effect. So low risk of side effects or complications resulting from it. That's the balance that we always strive for. So when a healthcare provider makes a recommendation, it should be based on empirical data, not upon anecdotal data. And this is essentially the standard in medicine, is this idea of evidence-based practice. So we're going to keep coming back to this, and essentially what this is doing is it's pointing us in the direction of empirical data as being the thing that we always want to rely upon. Now, another concept I'd like to throw out here is that of primary and secondary sources. Now, for our purposes, a primary source is the original point of publication of empirical data. So if a researcher conducts a study and then publishes it in a peer-reviewed journal, that peer-reviewed journal is the primary source. That's where the study originally appears. So we're going to consider that our primary source. Secondary sources are everybody else who writes about the study, or talks about it or reports on it. So if you think about things like newspapers, cable news channels, internet websites, everything else where they may talk about a study that was published in a particular journal, those are all secondary sources. And it's really, really important to kind of understand that distinction between the two and to keep them in mind. So as we're looking at health-related information that we encounter, we constantly want to be asking ourselves this question: are we looking at a primary source or are we looking at a secondary source? By the way, it doesn't have to stop at secondary. We could have tertiary sources. We could have a study published in a journal. The New York Times writes an article about it. Somebody else writes an article about the New York Times article. So we can get further and further removed from the original source. Now, the reason we want the primary sources is because that is written in the researcher's own words. No one else is interpreting it, just the researcher. When we're looking at secondary sources, we have to consider that now we've got a second person that's reading it, interpreting it, kind of imposing their own bias on it to some extent, and then reporting it. So it's not really necessarily exactly the way that it was originally reported. And sometimes the differences may be very, very minor, to the point where they don't make any difference at all. And sometimes they can be fairly significant. So I want to make sure that we have this distinction between primary and secondary sources. Now, here's an example of what can happen with primary and secondary sources. Here's an article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. HON home use of automated external defibrillators for sudden cardiac arrest. So this was an article that dealt with looking at the use of, these are defibrillators that are often kept in public sites like in airports and schools. So if somebody has a sudden cardiac event, they can use a defibrillator on them. And not every cardiac event can be treated with a defibrillator, but many can. And the question here is whether or not the use of these defibrillators has improved survival of people who've had cardiac arrests in places where the defibrillators have been available to them. So the study that these researchers did was to go out and find people who had suffered a cardiac arrest. And by cardiac arrest, it's basically a heart rhythm that can't support life. Doesn't mean that it stopped cold, but it's in a rhythm that it can't pump enough blood to keep the person alive. So they found people who had experienced them, and after going through the hospital, or after being admitted to a hospital, asked the question, okay, well, did they live or did they die? Were they discharged as a live discharge, or were they deceased in the hospital? And then they worked backwards to see how they were treated. There were three possibilities. They either could have been treated with a defibrillator if one was available to them, or they might have been, there might not have been a defibrillator available, but somebody was nearby who could administer CPR and did perform CPR on them. So that was the second alternative, was they got CPR. The third alternative was nothing. No CPR, no defibrillator. Maybe someone called 911, and that was the extent of their treatment at the time of the event. So then they asked the question, okay, now we know how they were treated. We know whether they lived or died. Is there an association between defibrillators and an increased risk of survival? And what they found was that, yeah, there is, but it's really slight. So in other words, if someone's treated with a defibrillator, they do have somewhat better chance of survival, but it's not that much better than CPR. If someone performs CPR on them, they're almost as likely to survive. It's very, very close. So the authors basically reached the conclusion that, it might be more cost effective to train people in performing CPR than it is to go out and buy a whole bunch of defibrillators, which incur a fairly sizable cost and then have to be maintained over time. So this was the study. It was a little bit nuanced. It wasn't a real clear-cut, good or bad, yes or no type of conclusion. Now, there were two articles that were written about this study, one by Reuters news service, the second one by the Associated Press. Now, both of them coincidentally happened to be published on Yahoo News on the same day. But those are the secondary sources. Okay, so we're looking at the primary source. Now let's take a look at the secondary sources to see what they had to say about this article. So the first secondary source was the Associated Press, and their conclusion: home defibrillators save lives in study. Now the second was written by a reporter at Reuters: home defibrillators do not increase survival. So these are almost totally opposite one another. You'd sort of have to wonder whether they're actually writing about the same study. But yeah, they are. They were both writing about exactly the same study. But this is what happens when you have a secondary source reporting something. They don't necessarily say it the same way that the researcher would say it. The researcher used very precise language. It was very nuanced. The reporters here didn't. So kind of brings up the question, well, why the heck would they do that? Well, I think the answer is pretty simple. When you're looking at a peer-reviewed journal, what makes people subscribe to peer-reviewed journals is that they publish the best available scientific data. If you want scientific validity, you go to a peer-reviewed journal. The motivation of Reuters and the Associated Press and other syndicated news agencies is not to publish the most scientifically valid information. It's to get the most mouse clicks. It's to get the most people to pick up publications off the news rack in the checkout line of the grocery store. they're trying to get as much interest as possible. So for them, having a really dramatic sounding title like that is a big plus. It doesn't matter if it's not really entirely scientifically accurate. What's important is that it's dramatic and it's eye-catching and people are going to want to read about it. So, and that's kind of what it takes, is to have something that sounds like that. They made it sound very black and white. It's good or it's bad, but there's no in between. And the reality is, yeah, there is an in between. That was not at all what the study said in its conclusions. So again, it's an illustration of how this concept of primary and secondary sources really plays out. Now, if one of us were relying on the secondary source without having seen the primary source, we would be going off potentially in the wrong direction. Another example, this is a study that was done looking at watermelon, of all things, looking at arginine concentrations, which is an amino acid. It's also a vasodilator in that it can relax the walls of arteries and theoretically improve blood flow. So this was a study that just looked at the levels of arginine that were produced, and it's actually converted in the body into arginine. So here are two studies. Now, by the way, they didn't really say anything about what this can do or not do. All they talked about was, is there any that do people who eat more watermelon seem to have more of this stuff in their bodies? Well, here are a couple of the studies, or a couple of the articles that have come out. So the first one was one of my favorites from NBC News. Watermelon may offer Viagra-like effects. This has absolutely nothing to do with the study. Nowhere in there did they talk about that. They talked about the biochemistry behind it, but nowhere did they suggest that it would produce Viagra-like effects. And there were several other studies that have also been done. None of them have really come to that conclusion at all. But if you're NBC News, that's a whole lot more dramatic sounding title than this one. That one's kind of a yawn. No one's going to want to read that. But if you're out there clicking on your NBC homepage, well, hey, this sounds like something I might want to click on. So it's something that we want to consider here, again, in terms of how secondary sources change the information. Now, by the way, it gets even better here. Boost your libido. New liquid Viagra watermelon juice launches in the UK. And of course, after that, I couldn't resist. I had to go look to see, hey, I wonder if you can get this stuff on eBay. Sure enough, yes, you can get citrulline powder, and citrulline is actually the extract that's found in the watermelon to improve sexual performance. Again, nowhere in any of the studies does it say that that will happen, but that's kind of where it goes to. So now we have these secondary and tertiary sources that are taking the information and kind of going in their own direction with it, basically serving their own purposes. Now, organization that I always like to mention is called Health on the Net. And Health on the Net is a non-governmental organization referred to as an NGO. It was created in the mid-90s quote, to guide laypersons or non-medical users and medical practitioners to useful and reliable online medical and health information help. So this was a need that was recognized in the 90s. This is kind of in the real early days of the internet. And there was this recognition that a lot of this information is not particularly valid. There's a real mixed bag out there. So Health on the Net was established. What they did was they created essentially what they call their Health on the Net code. And it's a guidelines, it's a set of guidelines that they believe that if a website follows those guidelines, they're going to be more likely to be publishing scientifically valid information. So for us, it's kind of an indicator. If we have a website that we're looking at which is in compliance with the Health on the Net code, it lends some credibility. We can assume that it probably has a little better credibility than some website that we find at random. Now, the way we would know is that it'll have that little blue logo on it. So if you see a website with that little blue HON logo on it, it means that it is a Health on the Net compliant site. Now, if you see it, this is really important, anybody can put that on their website pretty darn easily. What you should do is click on it. And by clicking on it, it will take you to the Health on the Net actual site, look up the website, and then tell you whether or not it's in compliance. So in this case here, you can see that this particular website is in compliance with the HON code. So this is how HON works. Now, by the way, you can also go to www.hon.ch, and what this will do is it'll allow you to actually search. You can go to their website, but they actually have a search engine there. You can search websites that are HON compliant and have that little logo on them. So HON is really kind of a nice resource to have available. There have been at least a couple of studies that I have seen that have shown that websites that are HON compliant do seem to have better quality health information. So these are studies where they've gone out, they've sampled the data, they've had healthcare professionals review it for the quality, and then assessed it. And it seems to be that HON websites do seem to be better quality in terms of health information. Now, Wikipedia, I always like to talk about just a little bit. Wikipedia is one of those sources that we all kind of like to use because it's so darn convenient, and very often it sounds like they know what they're talking about. And what I'm going to suggest is that we be kind of skeptical about Wikipedia because it is a secondary source. We don't know who's writing this stuff. That's a really important thing to consider. Wikipedia can be contributed to by anyone. I've added things to Wikipedia articles. I've made changes to Wikipedia articles where I've seen inconsistencies or inaccuracies. But someone can very easily do it who doesn't know what they're talking about and publish stuff that's incorrect. And it could be very minor, or it could be much more significant than that. So the idea is that it's self-policing, and in general, it's actually not nearly as bad as I would sort of have expected it to be, but it is kind of suspect. What I would say is don't assume that anything you find on Wikipedia is necessarily correct. Again, there are inaccuracies. There have been a number of studies that have been done that have looked at Wikipedia in terms of health information to see just how accurate it is. There's one right here where they looked at 47 Wikipedia articles on cardiovascular diseases. And the results here are down at the bottom. Wikipedia entries on cardiovascular disease lack accuracy, predominantly due to errors of omission. Further improvement of the Wikipedia content of cardiovascular entries would be needed before they could be considered a supplementary resource. So again, we have to think about the fact that it's a secondary source. We don't know who's writing these articles. They don't put their names down. So we have no way really to confirm who it is and whether or not we think that they're a credible source. So I would say when we're dealing with Wikipedia, I would use it with caution. What I would do is maybe look at their sources. Go down to the reference list, look to see who they're referencing as their primary sources, and hopefully they are primary sources, and then go back and actually read the primary sources for yourself. Don't assume that they're citing them correctly. Go back and read them for yourself. That's the very best way to make sure that you're really on track here and using the best available information. Now, one other note here on this idea of the secondary sources, that citation issue is a critically important one. We're going to come back to it in a couple of minutes. But the idea that they tell you who their primary sources are is incredibly important. Otherwise, you have no way to really even determine whether it's even close to reality. Now, in terms of having a process that we can use to assess the quality of information we find on the web. I have a 3-part process here called Credentials, Content, and Organization. And this is essentially a process that we use to assess information. And it's kind of going down a checklist. There's a worksheet that you can use, and that worksheet is actually in the textbook. And you can take a look at that and use that as a guide. You can photocopy that and use that as a guide to jot down notes to yourself as you're reviewing information on a web page. And then we can use that to kind of assess and then reach a conclusion whether or not we believe it's going to be a valid source of information. In addition, I've also written an ebook on the subject, which I have a link in Canvas that you can go and you can actually download that. It's a free ebook. You can install it on a mobile device or a Kindle or a reader, and again goes through the same process and contains the same worksheet. Now, this is a 3-step process. The first step is the credentials step, and the credentials process is basically kind of in recognition of the idea that we have no idea who's at the other end of the web page. Who the heck created some of this stuff? So what we want to know is, who exactly is this person or persons? Do they really know what they're talking about? Or is it a dog? We have no clue who's at the other end of that internet connection. And the idea here is really pretty simple. This does not need to be a big long process. Now, in class, when I do this, we do a little exercise. I give 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes have the class assess one of these 2 websites or some other one and find out everything you can about the individual who created the website. It is amazing how often you can come across stuff very, very, very quickly. You can make an assessment very quickly. It doesn't have to be a long, laborious process. So the basic question to ask: did the author identify their credentials? Are they telling us who they are? Do we have any clue who this person is? Are they giving you their names? Are they giving you anything about their background? And by background, we're looking for things like their education, their training, professional licenses, professional certifications, experience. What qualifies them to be offering this information that they're putting out there? Why should we believe them versus someone else? That's essentially the question that we're trying to ask. One of the things that I'll sometimes do is to look to see whether or not the individual has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. So I may go into PubMed and do an author name search on them and see if they come up. And if I see that they've actually published quite a bit of research in peer-reviewed journals, well, that kind of tells me something. The person has some background in empirical research and kind of knows what they're talking about. If not, it doesn't mean that they're bad or they don't know what they're talking about. It's still a question mark. So again, we want to know what are they claiming in terms of degrees, certifications, licenses, experience, and training. Now, one of the things that comes up a lot in healthcare websites is the idea of individuals who will claim that they have degrees in a particular field, but the degree is actually from a diploma mill. So if you're not familiar with the diploma mill, a diploma mill is essentially a school that offers a degree for life experience. So you're not really paying to go to classes and be evaluated and assessed on your performance in those classes. You're being given a degree because you worked for 5 years as a bookkeeper, and that's sort of like having a bachelor's degree in accounting. It's not really, but that's kind of the logic behind it. Now, the other idea here is those of certifications. And certifications can be good or bad. And when I say bad, I don't really mean bad. I mean they could be good or they could just be non-existent, although they may sound good on paper. Now, one of the places where we see this a lot has to do with the idea of nutrition and nutritionists. Now, nutritionists are kind of an interesting area because nutritionist is not a legally protected term in the United States. lawyer is a legally protected term. I can't call myself a lawyer unless I've got a law degree and I've passed the bar exam and have been admitted to the bar. I can't call myself a nurse unless I've passed an exam and I have a certain amount of experience and training. But I can call myself a nutritionist. And again, because it's not legally protected, anybody can do it. So very often what you'll see will be individuals who call themselves certified nutritionists. So this kind of sounds a little bit more legit, but it isn't really necessarily. So for example, here you'll see for $11.99 or $120 a month, you can become a certified nutritional therapist. And you just sort of click there and put in your credit card information and you're off and running. Here's another one, $99. And by the way, this is the same course as the $11.99 you saw earlier there. And this is an online nutritional therapist certification course. So here you can become a certified nutritional therapist. Is the degree of training the same thing that you would get in a classroom if you were in a legitimate degree program? I would say no, it's not. But people do it, and then they do claim those certificates as proof that they're certified professionals in the field. Here's another one. You can be a certified sports nutritionist for just $500. And if you go to Groupon, this is my favorite, you can find all kinds of deals there. So here we got certified child and personal nutrition, $39, down from $2,244 or down to $39. There's the nutrition coach certification, that's only $109. So with any of these, you can call yourself a certified nutritionist. Are you really getting the training? No, you're not. And people who claim these are not. But this is what happens. So I could very legitimately go out and make up these business cards that say Dr. Elio Spinello, certified nutritionist, after spending $39 at Groupon. And I can tell you that I honestly have very little formal training in nutrition. And not only that, I would make the worst nutritionist in the world because I would go out and tell people to eat more In-N-Out burgers. But I could very legally make up cards that look just like these. There's absolutely nothing on that card that would be in any way illegal. Although I would argue that it would be very much unethical and fraudulent because I don't have the training. And again, I honestly would probably be the worst nutritionist in the world. So we want to really be careful when we talk about, or when we're looking at information coming from, quote, nutritionists. Now, for the record, the person we would want to take nutrition advice from would be a registered dietitian. So someone with an RD after their name is someone who's typically going to have a bachelor's or master's degree, usually a master's, in human dietary sciences. They passed a board exam, and they usually have something close to 2,000 hours of clinical internship. So this is someone who's highly trained and legitimately the person you would want to go to get advice on nutrition. Now, Diploma Mills, I kind of talked about briefly earlier. These are essentially schools that effectively they're selling a degree. It's not a real degree. It's the illusion of a degree. It's a facade. I'll also add that these are totally illegal. These are in no way, shape, or form legitimate enterprises. Most diploma mills get shut down very quickly when they're found out. It is illegal to claim that you have a degree from a diploma mill on a job application because you're misrepresenting your background. You're misrepresenting your training and experience. So it is considered fraudulent, and it's actually a crime. State of Oregon is really comes down hard on academic fraud like that. And a lot of these schools are out there. There's this one is actually a surprise. It's been shut down before, and it comes back again. Sheffield State University. Okay, we're not talking about the prestigious University of Sheffield. We're talking Sheffield State University. And this is a quote school that you can go to and you can get your degree online. Now, it's not really online because all you're doing is giving them your resume. They look at it and they say, yeah, you got enough experience for whatever the degree is. We'll go ahead and award you the degree. Now, I actually went through this process just to kind of illustrate how it works. And if you go to the website here, you have a little menu, and here's all the pricing. And it's actually quite good. I mean, you can get a PhD for just $449, and in my experience, that's a pretty good deal. Once you do, you have to pick exactly what type of doctorate you want. So I decided here for my purpose, I'll pick a PhD, a Doctor of Philosophy degree. After that, you pick your major, and you just come off the list here and select it off the list. And this is very cool. If it's not on the list, if the major you want isn't there, you can actually just type it into that little box, and then you can still get your degree in whatever you put in there. You have to pick your GPA. Now, if you want to go with the 3.9 to 4.0 summa cum laude option, it's an extra $100, probably worthwhile, I might think. You can purchase additional transcripts that show what classes you've taken and your grades, and letters of verification that are written on the school's letterhead proving that you went to school there. Again, this is completely fraudulent and totally illegal, but people do it. And I'm kind of doing this just to illustrate just how easy it is for this to happen. And people do very often claim these degrees, and for some reason, when it comes to health-related websites, I see a lot of this, a lot more of it than I see in other disciplines. And down here on this page, you enter your resume. You paste your resume into this little box down here, and then you put in your information and your credit card, and they do accept all major credit cards, and you're good to go. Now, by the way, they claim that they're accredited by the Accrediting Commission of International Colleges and Universities. Now, what's really interesting is that if you Google that, the first entry that comes up, ironically, on Wikipedia, that shows up on a list of unrecognized higher education accreditation organizations. So a lot of these diploma mills will actually make up their own accrediting agencies and then accredit themselves so that they can put that on their websites. Again, it's completely fraudulent and illegal. Now, in the U.S., typically, if we're looking for an accredited school, we look for a regional accreditation agency. And there are several of them in the U.S. In California, we have the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, and that's who accredits CSUN and pretty much every other school in California. So if you go to, and the acronym is WASC, W-A-S-C, any WASC accredited school is going to have met a minimum standards for a rigorous educational degree program. So you have, you basically have some certainty that that program is what it says it is, and this is going to be true of, again, of any major university that's accredited. If you look at CSUN, USC, UCLA, Loyola, you name it, they're all going to have WASC accreditation. Schools that are unaccredited does not necessarily mean they're bad. Sometimes relatively newer schools, it takes a few years to get accredited. So they may be going through that process and haven't gotten there yet, or they just may be flying under the radar and are unaccredited and not really particularly worthwhile. That sometimes happens as well. So that gets us through assessing the credentials. Now, the content of the information, this is where we try to look critically at the content of the website in terms of what they actually have to say. And the biggest point here is really this third bullet point, are the statistics cited. For me, that probably is one of the most pivotal. if they're giving you good, solid citations to primary sources, that really counts for a lot. The citations have to be good enough for you to be able to go back and read those sources for yourself, though. If they're just saying, hey, there was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine that said this is really, really good, that doesn't mean anything unless they give you enough information that you can find that study for yourself and read it for yourself. Otherwise, you might find that they maybe have misquoted the study, or maybe the study wasn't done very well and you don't agree with it. That could happen. And I've seen cases, and I believe there's a little case study written up in the textbook in this chapter that deals with a situation where a study was taken completely out of context to prove a point that it really couldn't prove. But again, it's important that you have enough information to be able to go out and see that primary source. Are they using anecdotal evidence or testimonials? That's a really important thing to know. If you see that they're constantly just relying on testimonials, that's not worth very much. Usually my feeling is if that's the best they can do, it's probably not very worthwhile information. The next one is a really huge one, and that's this one here. Is anything being sold on the website? If they've got something for sale on the website, they have an economic interest in you believing them. Because if you believe them, you're more likely to buy something from them and they're more likely to make money off of you. So if I see something for sale, it doesn't mean they're lying. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. What it means is I can't rely on what they have to say. I have to get that somewhere else. I have to get that opinion from an independent, unbiased third party that doesn't have money on the line here for me believing them. So for me, that's a huge red flag if I see something for sale on the website. I'll almost always immediately go elsewhere to look for another opinion to validate it or shoot it down. Conspiracy theories are another good one. For some reason, I see a lot of these with health-related websites. And very often it's kind of a situation where maybe somebody has some sort of a supplement that they're really pushing, and what the real common one, this is the FDA wants to shut us down because they know that our product can cure cancer. Well, I don't think so. I think if you could cure cancer, that would be kind of a good thing, and people would be sort of pulling for you. Here's an example right here. This is having to do with a disease called keratoconus. It's a degenerative corneal disease. It causes loss of visual acuity over several years. And in this case, there's this little story here about this woman named Kristen who came up with this diet that she started to eat for herself, and she completely reversed her keratoconus. That has never been found to have happened in all the literature out there. And according to this website, her eye doctor submitted this fascinating case to multiple eye journals, to peer-reviewed journals, and made the point here, had she been treated with some drug or surgical technique, you can bet that it would have been published. It wasn't. So you're the only ones to hear about it. So basically the implication is they didn't publish it because it's not a drug or a surgery, and they're anti-drugs or they're anti-treatments that are not surgical or medical in nature. Having been a peer reviewer myself for close to a dozen journals over the years, I can tell you that's not how it works. If it works and it's scientifically valid, it gets published. They don't shoot it down because it's not medical or surgical. But it's a really great example, again, of kind of this idea of conspiracy theories, something we look out for. Example of something for sale. Again, here for the same disease. Somebody posts the question, what do you suggest for keratoconus? And then there's this answer here. Okay, well, full body detox, and then this eyes formula. Again, none of these things have ever been found to work. So there's no real scientific validity behind it. But the fact is they've got something for sale here. Just the fact that they're selling something tells me that they're kind of interested in their online store probably more than they are with the validity of their health information. Now, finally, we assess the organization. After we assess the credentials and content, we look at the organization. Now, I'm not talking about how well organized the website is. This is really what organization is hosting the website. Who exactly is paying for this? Who's hosting it? Whose web server is it? To see if this sheds any light on it. So, basic question, is this like a person's personal website, or is it part of a larger organization? Now, if I see health information on a website and it's some individual's own website and I don't know anything about them, and that kind of doesn't tell me a lot, and that's okay. But if I see that maybe it's on a website and it's hosted at the UCLA School of Public Health or the USC School of Medicine, well, okay, again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but I do know that those organizations have acceptable use policies, and they're not going to allow stuff to be placed on their web server unless it meets certain criteria with respect to some degree of scientific validity. They can't put anything there that's fraudulent or that's used to advertise a business typically. So with that said, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody snuck something in there that didn't belong, but I know that at least there are policies in place. So if it's an individual's website, just a personal website, again, it doesn't mean it's bad, it just means I don't know. It means it's a bigger question mark. Who funds the organization? Is there an organization maybe that is hosting the website that has a particular political or social agenda that might bias its interpretation or its presentation of the research? I've had students do projects with medicinal marijuana, and this is one of those areas that does seem to get politicized a lot. There are organizations on both sides of the issue that have very firm ideas about what they believe and what they think should happen, and I believe colors their perceptions. So when I see websites, again, on both sides of that issue, it's not at all unusual to find some degree of bias. I just normally expect it, and it's very, very easy for me to find very typically. So, again, recognizing that can exist can be an issue. Sometimes the URL can tell you a little bit about the website, whether it's a .com or .org. Now, there has been some research that has found that websites appearing on .org domains tend to be, in some cases, a little bit better quality. Not always, but sometimes. And part of the reason for that is that organizations like the American Medical Association are .org websites. The example here, APTA, is the American Physical Therapy Association, the American Public Health Association. Those are all .org websites. So again, those are sometimes associated with better quality information. .egus are in the U.S. typically 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities. Not necessarily a bad source of information, but not necessarily always perfect. .nets we don't see quite so much anymore, but those are usually internet service providers. .govs are generally pretty good sources. So these are going to be federal government agencies, so organizations like the CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institutes of Health, National Library of Medicine, all potentially very good sources of information. So definitely ones to consider. So that concludes our discussion with respect to assessing the validity. Make sure you do the reading in Chapter 4 on the book. And in the next online lecture here, we'll discuss efficient web searches.